which would have made it a bit easier to follow, but along with the unceremonious room change at the last minute, we lost the projector. So you'll just have to kind of bear with me a little bit. So this was based on research I did in the National Archives, qualitative research into economic and security relationships, FOI requests, that sort of thing. And my main argument is basically that Britain has supported the Indonesian occupation quite fundamentally from the 1960s, particularly from the mid-1960s onwards, in three main areas: diplomatic support, economic assistance, or economic investment, and security and military trading relationships. And so I'm just going to sort of give you an overview of those. I'm going to focus particularly on the diplomatic support during the takeover in 1960. So in the 1950s, Britain actually supported Dutch rule in West Papua and opposed Indonesia's claims on West Papua. The British Foreign Office described the UK position as this: it is strategically undesirable that control of Dutch New Guinea, West Papua, should pass to Indonesia. And they said that Indonesia's claim to West Papua was with little legal foundation. So that was the British position in 1950. It all changed in 1960s, and I'll sort of explain why. Now that process of changing basically sort of begun around the New York Agreement. We heard from Andy earlier. The New York Agreement 1962, that was what allowed the Indonesians basically to take over the territory, pending an act of free choice, an act of self-determination. And the British supported this behind the scenes. They actually supported the transfer of control from the Dutch to the UN and then onwards to Indonesia. But they were very candid privately about what this actually meant. The British Embassy said that Indonesia has got away with naked aggression. And the embassy did not for one moment suppose that when the time comes, there will really be very much choice for West Papuans. They said the Papuans have been sold down the river. Now, despite this, they continued to support the agreement, even though they were selling Papuans down the river in their own words. And so whilst this New York Agreement was going on, the UK and the United States particularly were basically altering their policy towards Indonesia. So before, they'd been supporting a policy of breaking up Indonesia through supporting rebellions in the periphery, particularly in 1958, trying to overthrow the post-independence president, Sukarno. When that didn't work, they shifted to a policy of fostering support amongst pro-Western factions inside the TNI, the Indonesian army, through security relationships, personal contacts, training programs, and things like this. And this continued even as Britain went to war with Indonesia over the creation of the Federation of Malaysia from 1963 to 66. They were still fostering contacts behind the scenes with favourable elements of the Indonesian army. Now, key to understanding the switch in Britain's policy towards West Papua is what happened in 1965 and 66. So basically you had a huge Indonesian Communist Party that was getting closer and closer to power, was coming closer and closer to the president Sukarno, and this extremely worried Western officials. They were concerned about the challenge that was being laid down to the prerogatives of Western investors and the risk of a Communist Party taking over. So what they basically did was, through propaganda and through intervention in Indonesian domestic affairs, they helped to foster a conflict between the Communist Party and the military. And in the process of this conflict, the post-independence president was overthrown, Sukarno, and the dictator, General Suharto, was put in power. So in the process of this, about 500,000 to 1 million suspected Indonesian communists were slaughtered by the military and various civilian militia organisations. And I've just got a couple of quotes that I found from my research at the National Archive on what the British position was on these slaughters. So this is the Foreign Office just after the killings began. Our objectives are to encourage anti-communist Indonesians to more vigorous action in the hope of crushing communism in Indonesia altogether. And then a little bit later they said, the generals are going to need all the help they can get. We can hardly go wrong by tacitly backing the generals. And then a year later, a British intelligence officer said the British policy was to encourage the emergence of a generals regime. And they did. And Suharto took over, and a dictatorship came into power and opened up the country for Western investment. And suddenly then, there was a real acceleration of support by the British state for Indonesia's claims in West Papua. And they actually materially supported the Indonesian army taking over through transferring arms and winding down the war against the Indonesian government in Malaysia as well. So when it came to the Act of Free Choice, the fateful 1969 vote, which we've already heard about, the British were very aware what was going to happen. The embassy described the vote as a foregone conclusion, but they said that they weren't going to do anything about it because, to quote the embassy in Jakarta, no Western government would wish to see the Suharto government, that is the new military government, in jeopardy. So they said nothing publicly, and they actually supported the Indonesian selective process for the Act of Free Choice. And they were well aware of the reality of Indonesian occupation. So obviously the occupation starts in 63, there were many years until you got to 1969 when the vote took place, where the Indonesian army was in control. And this was 1968 Foreign Office research memo describing what the situation was like in West Papua under Indonesian rule. They said, in the more remote villages where the army was represented, it was said to exercise complete control, imposing compulsory military training and indoctrination upon the inhabitants, and forcing villagers to obtain travel permits if they wished to leave their village for any purpose. Uncooperative individuals were often jailed or sometimes shot as subversive suspects. Indonesian retaliation for Papuan attacks was savage. That's the British Foreign Office describing the Indonesian occupation. But when the Act of Free Choice came to the UN General Assembly in 1969 for a vote, the briefing paper put to the British delegation at the UN said, privately, we recognise that the people of West Papua have no desire to be ruled by the Indonesians, and that a process of consultation did not allow a genuinely free choice to be made. So the British recognised what the reality was in 1969, but they leaned on their colonies, their ex-colonies, to vote for the Act of Free Choice at the UN, or to take note of it, and they studiously avoided anything controversial. Yeah, so that's the history. And that was only admitted, the reality of the Act of Free Choice was only admitted by the British government in 2004. Up until then, they pretty much maintained a stony silence. So just quickly, to go on to security assistance, the second prong, there's been a long relationship between the British state and Kopassus, which is the elite Indonesian Army Special Forces unit that's implicated in all sorts of human rights abuses in West Papua and East Timor. There used to be Kopassus officers trained in Hull, and they continue to be going through Cranfield University as well. I don't think anyone's really written about that, so it's maybe something that people could look at. And since 2009, 53 Indonesian military officers have been trained in the UK by MOD-affiliated programs. But the most important connection is with a unit called Detachment 88, which is the elite unit of the Indonesian police force. They have a human rights record described as appalling by Human Rights Watch, but they are trained by an array of Western nations at the Jakarta Centre for Law Enforcement Cooperation in Jakarta. And Metropolitan Police officers are based in Jakarta training this unit. In 2013, they provided over £300,000 and delivered 11 courses. And over the last 7 years, 1,500 Indonesian law enforcement officers have been trained by the UK. So I would suggest that this is something that the APPG could be looking at. I'm going to skip over the economic section because I've already spoken about that in the APPG, but I think these links with military units, with police units, is something that the APPG and parliamentarians could really be looking at, and we can be looking to break one of the links in the sort of capability chain that facilitates the Indonesian occupation, and Britain's a very important country for that. So thank you.
Thanks very much.